Welcome to Undercurrents of Romance, the show that celebrates every subgenre of romantic fiction. In each episode, I peel back the layers of your favorite love stories and chat with the talented authors who bring them to life. I'm your host, Tracey Devlyn. Now, let's dive in with today's guest. Hello, romantics. I'm here with New York Times bestseller Melissa Marr to talk about her newest adult romantasy, Reluctant Witch. Thanks so much for joining us, Melissa.
Thank you for having me.
You betcha. Well, I have to ask, and I did find this on your website, and I do have to ask, why are you utterly incapable of sticking to one age demographic, format, and genre?
I think it's a case that I start a story and and then at the end I just go to my agent and say, I didn't mean to. It's it's not I'm terrible at branding. I'm absolutely terrible. Like my next book is a contemporary romance and the last one was a comic for DC Comics. So
Well, it seems like you have. I noticed a number of best-selling accolades on your website. So, whatever system you're using, I don't think you should change it. I think it's working out for you just fine.
I think the trick is to read everything. I
Mm,
mean, there's no section of the bookstore that doesn't lure me in. So if I'm going to
mhm.
read everything, why wouldn't I want to write everything?
Yeah, yeah. And I've heard some authors describe it as a kind of like a palate cleanser, where maybe if you've written a couple of books in this genre and you want to try something else, especially if you have a really popular best-selling series,
Hmm.
and you want to just do something a little bit different. It's just a nice palate cleanser for authors, to do something a little bit different.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case when I finish something. I want to go somewhere else, but I also I don't write one book at a time. So
Ah,
that's part of it is that if I'm writing a fantasy and I get stuck on it, I swap over to my contemporary or I swap over to, a children's book. And that
yeah.
way, while I'm in the percolation stage of any book, because you get to that point, right? Where you just like you
Mhm.
even with an outline or a synopsis, you get to the point where you're like, wait a second. And when that happens, I just switch projects for a couple weeks and then that gives that like back burner time to do its thing.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden the epiphany hits and I just swap burners.
Yeah, yeah. Now, what do you do to help yourself get into that new voice? Because writing a children's book versus writing a romantasy versus writing a contemporary, those are slightly different voices and word choices and things like that. What do you do to flip that switch?
I mean, for me, some of it is that I'm reading those things. So I read middle grade. I read picture books. I have a 12-year-old, a 26-year-old, and a 31-year-old. So I've always had kids in different age groups and I read with
Hmm.
them. And so because I'm doing that, like if I just get caught up and my son is in a kick that we're reading a bunch of like middle grade, then I want to stay in that voice, right?
Okay.
Or when the world feels overwhelming, I mean, romance
Mhm.
is my standby. It is the thing I
Yeah.
read the most of. And after reading nothing but romance for a couple months, I'm like, I don't want to write fantasy. I want to write, I want to write romance.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're here to celebrate your release, Reluctant Witch, which is book two
mhm.
in the Course in Magic series. Are your fans relieved to get their hands on this sequel to Remedial Magic?
I didn't mean to, but I actually did a cliffhanger for like the second time in my career. And my daughter she lives in Norway. I get this frantic middle of the night email. Where is the ending? And I was like, but like you have all the pages. She's like, no, no, second book, get on it. So, and she wasn't the only one. So I
Yeah.
felt a little guilty because I don't usually do that, but there seems to be some happiness at being able to go from one straight through now.
Hmm. Well, that's just a perfect example of you write the book the way it needs to be written. And although the ending might not be what every reader was hoping for. It's what the book needed. I
Yes.
found myself, because I had not read the first book, um, and I found myself wishing that I had time to go back and read it simply because I would have loved to have watched Ellie and Prospero. Am I saying that right?
Mhm.
Prospero? Prospero fall in love. I think that that would have just been a wonderful, just a wonderful story to watch it, kind of work its way through, because they're just both so wonderfully protective of each other. Now, did that come out in, is that something you knew you wanted to do in the beginning or, from the start, or did that just kind of come through the drafting of the story?
I think that's part of what I think love is. And so I think that there's a little bit of my heart in this couple, in that I think part of love is, that sort of urge to protect and urge to support, and also to let the person you're with be who they are. And
Hmm.
I felt like with this couple, Ellie in particular, because, she is born now, a contemporary
Right.
character, as opposed to Prospero, who is Victorian era. So the way they interact, the way they express love is going to be reflective of their time period. And I
Hmm.
felt like the one thing that a woman of her character in the Victorian age wouldn't have experienced is that sense that, you know, someone wants to take care of her because she's the big bad, she's scary.
Yeah.
And I think that's very satisfying as a reader
Hmm.
and I think as a person.
Well, they had a little rift. I will be careful of spoilers,
Hmm.
right? They had a little rift, and at one point, Prospero started courting um, Ellie again, and I loved how she went about doing that and bringing her little gifts and things
Hmm.
like that. I just thought that that was so sweet and so romantic, and so Victorian, right? I mean.
Yes. Yes. It was a really fun excuse for me also. I mean, my background, my graduate degree was in the 1800s to early
Ah.
1900s literature. So this is what I lived and breathed. It's what I taught,
Yeah.
and I think there's just something charming about that sort of romance,
Yeah.
about being courted. And I
Hmm.
think for me that just feels, I don't know, swoony.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like it. It was great. It was a very sweet portion of the book. When other times in that book it gets a little bit heavier, a little
Hmm.
bit more exciting and suspenseful. So that was a nice little calm down moment in there. So it was great.
Thank you.
S- what inspired you to write this series, this Course in Magic series? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. The pandemic, actually. I have chronic health issues. I have lupus and a heart condition and some lung damage. And so I have a bunch of medicine that I take to stay alive, right?
Hmm.
And in the pandemic, there was a month that my medicine was delayed because of all the things going on. And I started thinking about how far would I go in order to survive? And what would I fight for? Which led to this world where instead of, inhalers and pills and shots and all that,
Hmm.
it's magic. And if you have this place, I don't want to erase, and I know this is a strange sentence, but I don't want to erase my health considerations. I kind of think my chronic health has been a superpower in some ways. It's taught me to look at the world differently. So I don't want a world where it's erased, but I wanted a world where instead of a pill, it's magic that controls the symptoms. And
Hmm.
and that was the heart of it. And I was like, okay, so how do we build this world? And each of the protagonists has something they desperately want. And the problems in the world make it impossible to have that.
Yeah.
So I think for me, that sort of external, internal motivation all comes down to what we need, what we want, and what are the obstacles we have to overcome to get it. And
Hmm.
I mean, that's my brand. That's what's actually consistent in all of my books.
Okay. All right, great.
So,
Did you
yeah.
find one of these characters a little bit more of a challenge to write than the other?
Um, I think Ellie was a little harder for me. Prospero makes sense to me. She's prickly. Um, she's got a bad temper. People think she's mean. Um, that's kind of been my biography for a lot of years. And here comes Ellie, who has this sort of optimism and knows what she wants. And I'm not an optimist by nature. So sometimes having that perspective was
Mm-hmm.
really challenging to write. Whereas Prospero, like, I've told you what I have told you. That should be that, is very much my approach. Um, so I think Ellie was my problem child.
Yeah. Yeah. Good deal. Well, one of the things that I like to dive into on this show is finding the story's undercurrent with the author. It's that second beating heart of the story that flows beneath the lover's journey. And I wonder, and you might have touched on this a little bit when you were talking about the inspiration for the story, but I was wondering if you could tell us what the undercurrent that's flowing beneath Ellie and Prospero's story. Because sometimes there's more than one.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my motivation was the health thing, but the romance part of it is about finding someone who sees you as you are
Mhm.
and still wants to be there. Um, I'm an idealist, and the idea that you can be who you are and the person you're with ultimately accepts you, warts and all, is is I think a truth. I know it's part of romance, but I also think it's truth. That
Mhm.
kind of complete love. And of course I'm a little sappy because I found my person,
Yeah.
who doesn't mind my bad temper and is willing to on a whim hop in a kayak and go on a trip.
Yeah.
That kind of, and I'm 53. I was
Mhm.
I was 40 before I found my person and I think that was part of it. Here's Prospero, who's been doing the witch thing for 150 years,
Yeah.
and suddenly there's your person. And I think that's part of the promise of romance, is that we
Mhm.
can all find that.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's my undercurrent here.
Okay. All right. No, I like that a lot. What are two or three tropes that readers can look forward to while reading Reluctant Witch?
So magic small towns, the obvious. Fake marriage. Um, Amnesia. I don't know if that's too much of a
Yeah.
spoiler. Um, and a bit of, an age gap. Victorian to now is quite the age gap. So, yeah,
Yeah.
very
Yeah. No.
intentional trope inclusion.
Yeah. 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 And I think you could probably even add Grumpy Sunshine in there too, more than likely. Yeah. Just a little
Yeah,
bit
I mean
there.
that's sort of my perpetual trope.
That's
That's
great.
everything I write.
What romance book have you read recently that you could recommend?
It is called, I think it's Where the Rhythm Takes You. It's a YA romance, set in the Caribbean islands, and it's so swoony. It was one of those read one chapter going to bed, and instead I'm looking at the clock going, it's 2 a.m. I'm still
Yeah.
reading. It was so, so rich. Contemporary YA, very low spice, but just so swoony. And if you're looking for more fantasy, I'd look at Fire in the Sky, which is Sophie Jordan, Dragons,
Mm.
historical. It's like a sort of medieval period, not low spice. Um, but again, just that sort of you start to read a chapter and you get swept up. And for me,
Hmm.
that's everything. Like
It is.
I want
Yeah.
that immersion. And both of
Hmm.
those books definitely gave it to me.
It's so hard. It's one of those things that nobody tells you once you become a writer,
Mhm.
that that full immersion experience that you get when you're reading a book, that gets less and less as a writer because it's very difficult to turn off that editor mind, isn't
Definitely.
it? Yeah,
It
yeah.
is. And I just, I start thinking where it fits and tropes and I'm like, stop analyzing.
Yeah.
And as someone whose background is in literary studies, that's extra difficult.
Yeah.
So I often find that the combination of my background and writing makes it like I probably start 50 books for every one I keep
Ah,
read the whole way
yeah.
through.
Oh, yeah.
So finding a
That's
couple that
tough.
I love is just
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you shared those with us. Thank you. That's great.
Mhm.
Um, Now, it might be this series, but I'm going to ask you this question anyway. Is there a story that you would love to write but haven't yet taken that plunge, for whatever reason?
Yeah. I I want to write a historical, but a historical that has a contemporary aspect.
Kind of like a
Very
dual
A
timeline
dual
or something like
timeline.
that?
Yeah, a
Okay.
dual timeline that has that connection. And, you know, it's again, literary background. I love Faulkner. I love the interesting things he does.
Hmm.
I focused on narrative theory, and that just seems like the book. And I have one I work on periodically. I've got three time periods, and I work on it, and it's something is missing. But that's my goal book that
Yeah,
hasn't gotten
yeah.
it there.
All right. Well, I'm sure you will get there sooner or later. You seem like a very determined person, so I suspect that will be forthcoming.
I do hope. I do hope.
Uh, all right. Well, before we go, can you give us a hint of what's coming up next? You'd mentioned a contemporary. Can you talk a little bit more about that, or is that still kind of, under
Yeah.
wraps?
I made the interesting choice to end up having three books out within 10 months.
Oh my.
I didn't mean to. But again, the problem with writing more than one at once. So Tony and Addie Go Viral is a contemporary, very spicy romance that comes out August 12th.
Okay.
And then the second one in that world is January 2026. So those are both done.
Okay.
And Tony and Addie is already up on NetGalley and pre-order and whatnot. But both of those are our world, except one of the books is about an author who finds her true love, and the second one is her publisher, her editor, who finds her true love.
Oh,
So
well,
playing a little bit in,
yeah.
in publishing.
Yeah, that's fun. That's unique. I don't know if I've ever seen that before, so that's great. I'll keep an eye out for that for sure.
Thank you.
Well, folks, when this episode airs, Reluctant Witch will be out, so be sure to order your copy today. You can check out Melissa's website at melissamarbooks.com. Melissa, what social media outlets are you most active on?
Um, Instagram and Facebook. Facebook is Melissa Marr Books, and Instagram is Melissa Marr Writing,
Okay.
and Blue Sky, which I think is also Melissa Marr Writing.
Okay. Great. Great. Thank you. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for joining me. It was so much fun talking to you about Reluctant Witch. I'm very happy to have been able to get a chance to read this. It was such a joy.
Thank you very much. I had a lot of
Yeah.
fun chatting with you.
Yeah, you betcha. Well, many thanks to everyone listening. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Undercurrents of Romance. You can find more information about the show at Tracey Devlyn /podcast. I'm sorry, tracydevlyn.com /podcast. Undercurrents of Romance is a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. I'll be back soon with another great romantic read. In the meantime, enjoy the adventure, everyone.